Well, the parachute never looked more like a mushroom than it does right now. I couldn't really see you all in the firelight last night, so this is like seeing you for the first time. Welcome, and I hope you feel free to interrupt what's going on at any time and ask questions, or if something needs clarification, please don't hesitate. My hope for these kinds of retreats is that it will quickly become so interesting to everyone that the presentational form will transform itself into a dialogue among many people. It seems to me that's when it happens best, and I don't think people would be here if they didn't have strong opinions and ideas about probably everything which is said. So that's the way the group mind is generated, by everyone opening up and expressing how they relate to these things that we're going to discuss. I guess the place to start is sort of with looking at the notion that the dawning paradigm of postmodern consciousness seems to be the growing awareness that we don't know what is happening at all, that all of the models whose implications have been worked out over the past 500 years or so have come to a place where they are now recursive, and they no longer can be pushed forward as models of explanation. In other words, they are completed, and ontological analysis of how they work now shows us the limitations of their application to reality. They just simply cannot, there is not more blood to be squeezed from the stone of science. There may be further discoveries, but further growth and understanding along those lines now seems unlikely, what with complementarity principle, Bell's theorem, the primacy of language in the formation of ontology. All these things show the relative power of science to account for reality, where before it was assumed that science would ultimately give a good account of reality. So postmodern living is living in the light of the fact that that faith has dissolved away, and that we're now living in some kind of intellectual free space or fire-free zone where everything is up for grabs. And the 20th century's fascination with the archaic, with shamanism and breakdown of perception through modern art, exploration of the unconscious through psychoanalysis, mass political movements, all of these things relate to this fascination with the archaic, which is an effort on the part of the culture to stabilize itself, because we really have, having seen the limitations of science, we have discovered we are in a small rowboat in a dark ocean, and we're being swept we know not where. So all past tradition is searched, magical traditions, alchemical traditions, lost philosophical traditions, pre-literate tribal traditions. Everything is frantically searched for a key. And while there are consoling perceptions that arise out of this search through all this other extended human knowledge, there haven't yet emerged certain answers about what is going on. This is why several people last night referred to how weird the time is, how hopeful we are with so little reason on the surface to be hopeful. And it's because the gelling out of this historical problem is happening right now, and it's not clear what it will become. Meetings like this are efforts to build an understanding of it. It doesn't appear that it's going to filter down through the transformation of institutions of control. It appears more like it's going to be some kind of proletarian upwelling of a shift of point of view. Now, the shorthand way of saying what I just said is that we now know that we don't know anything. And things like the psychedelic experience and the use of psychedelic plants throws open doorways that science was able to successfully keep closed during its heyday, because they were areas where the number of variables exceeded science's power of description, and therefore they said, well, we'll just keep driving straight ahead and we'll go up those rivers later. But now that is all changed, and the exploration of the existential dimension of not knowingness, which psychedelics makes possible, is what is forming modern people, I think. I mean, people who will be seen to have led lives that were relevant 50 years from now or 100 years from now. People who had actually figured out the context of the world they were living in and tried to come to terms with it. And this morning I think we want to talk about plants and how they relate to the planet. But before we do that, I want to paint a picture for you of a mandala, which then I will discuss later in other meetings. But my notion of what the postmodern person's mandalic projection onto the world should be in terms of a map of understanding is a quadrated circle in which psychedelics and feminism and cybernetics and space travel are the 4 parts of the circle. And in the center of the circle, looking backwards in time, there is a category that I would call conservation, which means conservation of the planet, conservation of traditional and historical knowledge, conservation of values, conservation in the sense of intelligence husbanding the planet. And when the mandala is flipped over and you look through it into the future, conservation has been replaced by art. Art is the ultimate expression of this transformation of unorganized matter into ideas which human beings carry on. And we carry it on in a technical mode out of necessity, but in the artistic mode out of a kind of upwelling of ecstatic self-expression about the universe. So conservation is the way we relate to the past, and human history is seen as an object of collective artifice making in the future, culminating in the notion of the flying saucer. To do this, we have to completely redesign our understanding of reality, which in terms of practical experience will mean that reality itself will appear to be redesigned. And I touched on this just for a moment last night when I mentioned plants and said how admiring I was of them because they exist on sunlight, air, and earth, and that this is what we have to learn to do in order to release spirit out of the ape matrix that we're bound in. And strangely enough, the way this is to be done, apparently, is by a redefining of the nature of the biological world in relationship to this other kingdom of being, which we call plants. Plants represent some kind of entire other dimension of existence, of which we view the topological manifestation of the form, but are completely occluded as to the network of energy and information that this represents. And like the zoological kingdom, which has thousands of forms of expression and progressively more complex forms which culminate in self-reflecting primates, the vegetable kingdom seems to have intelligent species and gradations of awareness in the world, so that we are opening a dialogue at the end of history with this other form in the biosphere, which we are just beginning to cognize as our own understanding about what the world is really about falls into focus. And certainly 100 years ago, no one would have thought that this was in the direct line of historical development of the high-tech civilizations, that they would have to explore the mind of the vegetable plant goddess, who was the only force contending with them for control of the planet. That's what it's come down to. So, with that kind of idea in mind, the notion of plant and planet, which is a phrase of Anthony Huxley's, which is wonderful. Kat, maybe you would want to talk about this. Is this a good...
Yeah. I was thinking last night and this morning about plants particularly because of our talk that I anticipated, and back at the tent a little while ago I had a gnawing feeling that I was ignoring the animals too much, and then I arrived here and they all began to gnaw on me. I just got about 14 ant bites just sitting here. You see me scratching all over. So I feel grounded again. I don't know about having a dialogue with the end of history through plants, actually. I don't know about that. But I do think that they are this obviously great and ever-present mystery which we ingest all day long without thinking of those as plants, without thinking of them as sacred plants in the way that we do the sacred ones. Their chemistry is, their input is influencing us all the time, whether we eat meat or not. We eat plenty of plants and we breathe from them, and we soothe our nerves by seeing them and being near them, and we go out into places like this and see kinds we've never seen before and marvel at how they can survive. They're real models of graceful survival, aren't they? In the jungle, where we've spent a fair bit of time, the competition, it seems, is for light and for protein, I guess, for organic matter, the animals competing. And here it's obviously for water. They have a kind of a deal. If you look around under the bushes, you know, you see wonderful wildflowers right now. The rains have just held on, the moisture's held on long enough that many things are growing. The short life cycle plants are going through their short, intense life cycle, and they often need shade to do it. So you can see, we found something that we were sure was an African violet under a bush yesterday, you know. You can see wonderful things if you look carefully and don't bother anybody else who might be under there. The question I've been asking of myself recently and of a few other people, now I have many of you to ask it, I hope I get some answers, is how can a plant be a teacher? I asked this of someone the other day who was deeply involved in neuro-linguistic programming, and he got way off on a tangent about what does this kind of question mean, you know, and just broke down every part and phrase of it. It was wonderful, you know. We never got to anything like what he thought about the answer, but it does assume all sorts of things. You have to have an image of what you think of as a plant, which, although we have a sort of language verified easy answer, doesn't really touch on the reality. And then you of course have to think what you mean by teacher. Well, I know there's at least one biologist, serious biologist in the group here, so I'm hesitant to define a plant. Just a moment. I guess from my point of view as an observer, I've done botanical illustration, and I really valued the opportunity I had to learn to really look at them. And then when you think you've really looked, look closer, You could just keep on learning from them just visually that way. But they are organisms like us that draw in all the elements, fire in the form of the sunlight and water and air and earth, and go through this transformation of energy into something else in the same way that we do. This moment right now is when they're doing that most energetically for the year. They're taking that moisture in there. You can look at each one, the leaf tips are new, and the tissue is soft, and the colors are bright, as well as the blossoming and all that. They're also laying out the structure, as I understand it, for that growth to become more permanent, more woody, the perennials anyway, so that next year during the year they'll fill that out. Next year they'll come from that place. They're doing this, envisioning the future, what they'll have to deal with, how to move to make their interface with it, and then how to reproduce. And their little messages are going into the seeds coming from pollination of other plants. So it's always like with us, when you choose a mate, it's your choice for how you'd like the future to be, right? My genes, your genes, here it goes down the line. Really all I have about this is questions. I hope you don't mind if I just throw questions up, and then if anyone wants to say anything, please do, including you, One thing I wonder is, we regard ourselves as such individuals. We don't think of ourselves as a species much. Terence talks about that a fair bit. But in our daily life, we really identify ourselves as individuals, as some of us having more power, more clarity, more energy, more talent, whatever. We divide that way. With plants, we tend to think of each plant on the species basis, I wonder if how much that's true. Plants we're familiar with, like ayahuasca, Banisteriopsis caapi, in the South American jungle. If you want to make this visionary drink, you go and find a member of that species. But different members have different potencies and different takes on the same kind of message. This gets to the teacher part. A friend of ours, Eduardo Luna, interviewed a number of shamans in the jungle. They use this term, plant teacher, in Spanish, as we've come to use it too. And he asked them, do you think that all plants have a plant teacher in them? Or do you think that some do? And they were divided on this question. Some people think that only the sacred plants do, right? Other shamans said, no, all plants do, just some of the spirits. They call them the mothers, the mother of the plant, or the spirit, or the teacher. Some are stronger. So that implies that every time we eat any plant, we're taking in that teacher. They mix these plants with ayahuasca, which already provides the vision. Then they take a new plant that they don't know so well, or that they want some particular aspect of, and they mix it in with that and take it and feel that they're irradiating what is that plant, what is the personality, whatever you want to call it, of that plant, and that they can take on the qualities of that plant. So I think the Indians in this area, as I understand, did that too with their plants. They wanted to take on the quality of the peyote. Is a good one, I mean, it lasts a very long time in a very subtle way, doing who knows what all that time, when it's not being eaten by something which is metabolizing the teacher in it. Is the teacher in it when it's just sitting there all that time? Is it experiencing the visions that come with that come into the animal organism that ingests it? I mean, I don't know. And I guess on the species and individual thing, I wonder, as an adjunct to that, when you grow your own plants, anyone who gardens, if you grow your own vegetables, how they taste different than vegetables that obviously at the store, they've probably not been grown with even the same kind of physical care, but certainly not the same kind of attention.
It's the question for me, or what always astonishes me about it, is where does the information come from? I mean, the peyote plant or the ayahuasca vine or the mushroom growing there in the jungle or on the desert, how did it manage to tap in and become filled with a universe of alien platonic beauty? Why is that there? All the rules of orthodox evolutionary theory conserve only what is necessary is conserved. So it's very hard to understand why a plant needs a library card at the intergalactic library, because it's just sitting there in the desert of some planet, alive and living.
But each plant is different too. I mean, their library cards don't take them to the same libraries even, Each one of these visionary plants provides something distinct, and sometimes you can see how it's a cousin of that one, and sometimes you can't see that they're related at all.
Well, isn't it that mind is somehow at the reflexive level chemical, and that when you change the chemistry of the engine which is giving the pictures change? Sometimes it seems almost like a biological radio that you tune into very strongly broadcasting stations, some of which are, alien, high-tech, insectoid, science fiction places. Others are jungle worlds or things that you can't even English.
Giant human teachers. I met one. He was 40 feet tall, and took me by the finger like I was a little child and led me through. What was that doing in the plant?
Yeah, what is it for? Sure.
Yes.
When you take a longer slice, you realize that the existence of the individual is like an illusion, and that really the planet is involved in some kind of chemical process which is like a gene swarming. And it's been going on for 1 billion years with more and more, and animals and plants as species and as individuals are just aggregates of genes of varying degrees of permanence. The individual is a very impermanent aggregate of genes. The species has a slightly longer duration. But what's really happening is these information transferring molecules are just swarming on the surface of the planet and controlling, as you mentioned, the weather, the chemistry of the soils, the rate of heat transfer. They've discovered now that plankton control weather in the oceans by controlling the surface reflectivity. The question, I think, is the peculiar dualism in the world of information. Why does it seem that reality is not reality? Why are there co-present, actually, two worlds are co-present in our experience? This is the taboo subject that we're here to talk about. The weird fact that there are two worlds, one of which our culture doesn't acknowledge, but we all experience. That's a very schizophrenic situation to be in. We all exist in both of these worlds, but our language, our culture, our institutions tell us, no, there's only one world. We have gotten into this lethal cul-de-sac where, by not acknowledging the second world, we have veered off on a tangent which is threatens our extinction now. This obsession with control of world one, matter, energy, and the complete ignoring of the world of consciousness which stood in front of it and manipulated it, but just taking that as a given has created this fantastically imbalanced culture.
I think that gets back to the plants as teachers, because since we do, as in your words, play with fire as human beings, perhaps the question you were asking as to the plants as being teachers, my feeling was at the time was they're in communication with us as we are in communication with them. We're all transparent beings. You're talking of genes swarming on the planet. There's no safe in which we lock our own human knowledge. We're transparent to all around us. And if you get into intelligent plants, which is what we were talking about earlier, perhaps, I mean, if you follow that logically out, why not have teachers as chemicals? That's how they can manifest within this particular body and use library card, as your words.
They realize that we're doers and shapers.
Well, I think there's only one life on the planet, though, and to say that we're separate from the plants or from this or from the air is a fallacy.
So that's a great image, the growing transparency. That's a good idea for what the end of history is. It's that everything becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, and as it becomes clearer, boundaries disintegrate, and everything is seen to be of the same stuff.
Well, I think for much of the world, and still, for instance, in the Amazon and other cultures where it tuned into nature, it was very transparent for very, very long. Progress was the losing of that transparency and the, forging ahead of certain parts of it, and almost to the point of just either eliminating to extinction or to the extinction of memory the lessons. One day I think I was doing bookkeeping or something very mundane, and the little voice that interrupts every once in a while said, a plant teacher is a teacher who has taken the form of a plant. And then that raised all these questions for me, because does that mean there are teachers floating around looking for places to land, right, and ways to interface with the other species, and I've always thought of rocks, big rocks in many places in the world. You can sit on them and you can just hear them, and feel them. Really.
I'm sure you know Rupert Sheldrake's theory. Well, it's basically the idea that things of like kind resonate together. And when I've thought about this problem before, about LSD and where does it fit into all of this, LSD is in the morning glories of central Mexico and the far Pacific. And I think that what makes a plant teacher complex is how many people it's taken. And that a plant that has been used 100,000 years is filled with all of the contents of the minds of the people who took it over that time. But I want to introduce the notion that life, the plants and the animals, are intrusions into three-dimensional space of some kind of topological manifold of a higher order. You see, the way in which a chair differs from a giraffe is that if you slice through the chair and then come back and examine it 12 hours later, it will be the same, but the giraffe will have changed radically. This is because by cutting into the giraffe, you have intruded into the temporal dimension of its existence. It is more like a musical note than an object. It must be born, grow, mature, and die. And that process, growth, maturity, and death, is how three-dimensional beings like ourselves describe the intrusion of these hyperdimensional vortices into our world. That's the mystery of life, cannot be encompassed in 3 dimensions. Life is a hyperdimensional object. All hyperdimensional objects are organisms. whether they be societies or animals. So the question of what is the plant, when you ask yourself, what am I? What you immediately concentrate on is what philosophers call your internal horizon of transcendence. You look into yourself to understand yourself. When we try to describe a plant, we inevitably give a topological mapping of it, how it appears to us, its uptake of minerals, its surface reflectivity, its weight. But the plant obviously experiences itself very differently. All life has an internal horizon of transcendence toward which it aims. It's Whitehead called it appetition. It's inclusion of sensory data out of which it maps being. But what the nature of this higher dimension is that these vortices are intruding into our dimension from is absolutely anybody's guess. I mean, you can call it a mathematical conundrum or a religious mystery, but it's what's making the world happen. It's how the mystery of our being will eventually be shed one more level of veil to let us understand it. You see, an organism is a chemical system which does not run down. The second law of thermodynamics says that the whole universe tends toward the dissipation of structure and the release of energy and heat, and then everything, all structure, all energy is dissipated. But the life has achieved the miracle of, by being an open system and taking material into it and extracting energy from it and getting rid of waste, life has been able to leave the main stream of thermodynamic degradation and establish itself at an equilibrium point off that graph and maintain itself there for, at least on this planet alone, 4 billion years. Now, the average life of a star in this galaxy is on the order of 2.5 billion years. Some last longer. But that means that biology is no epiphenomenon, no iridescence off the surface of matter, as the 19th century physicalists wanted to describe it. It means that life is indicative of a physics of higher dimensions which intrudes into this otherwise thermodynamically degrading system which we call the physical universe. And information, there seems to be an informational ghost of this universe which is somehow co-present at all points within the matrix, perhaps a la Bell's theorem or something like that. And that's what the psychedelic experience shows you. It shows you a hologrammatic space of information where, by sitting still in your room and sending the mind, you can cross the universe in an instant, and return. And the question of, is this real, is in bad taste. It violates the two ontological categories, you see. I mean, it just isn't done. But you're right. But the plants seem to be the things which shake us out of these cultural conventions. We have this very bad habit of when we encounter a new experience, we describe it. And as we describe it, we erase its reality.
You reduce it.
And replace it with a map. And forever after, when we encounter that input, we access the map and overlay it over the thing and say, aha, I know what this is. And so by the time a child is 5 years old, they have completely entered into a symbolic construct which hides the real world from them. And fortunately, these plant teachers seem to have the unique ability of showing you the relativity of language, which for us is the relativity of being. And then you are freed because you have seen something incontrovertible. There's no going back then. That is the great first gateway on the path to realize the relativity of language and the the malleability of the world. For instance, coming out into the desert is typical of people seeking visions. The first thing you have to do is leave the polis. Culture is this effort to hold back the mystery and replace it with a mythology, which is then in the control of those who recite that mythology, whether they be shamans or priests. This holding back of reality is what Christian theologians call the fall, our strange alienation from nature that causes us to crowd into cities and mint money and put a price on everything. And this is why it's so important to go back to the Amazon and eastern Indonesia and these places and try and understand what spark it was that those people kept, over the millennia, while we became the prodigal son and wandered into matter and, whored in the cities on the plain, and have now come full circle and returned at the end of history with the dilemma that we have made such a mess of things that there's nothing we can do now but lay. Each stage is a greater distancing from the wellspring of being, and it's brought us, to the valley of dry bones, to the valley of the apocalypse, and now the fat is in the fire. Now we'll find out what stuff man is made of as the chickens come home to roost. But, well, no, I'm very optimistic. I just... Is it my metaphors or my pessimism? Oh, the horrible metaphors.
The metaphors. I'm used to
Yes, well, the rhetorical hyperbole, unbridled.
I'd like to ask a question about this two-world thing, because it interests me greatly. Do you think that there's two worlds, or that there's many, many worlds?
Yes, well, I think you're right. But there are different orders of different worlds. I guess it was the physicist Wheeler who thought that every time there was a choice, the universe took both paths, and had always done this, so that the number and kinds of universes was, staggering. Right. I find that cumbersome. And but there certainly seem to be a number of universes, and there seem to be different kinds of universes. For instance, you can tune from channel to channel, but some of them you can't make heads nor tails out of, It's just too far away from your conceptual schema for you to be... So it's sort of like watching ideological mandalas or something. You can't say much about it afterwards, but it certainly was compelling while it was going on. And... well, I don't know, Robin. You're such a skillful questioner. You've brought yourself to the doorway of my most recent mania. Maybe I should unburden myself briefly about it. One of the weird things about growth, or trying to make your ideas always become new, is that you always assume you're going to know what the next step is. That even though you're going to become more and more enlightened, there won't be any surprises. So a few weeks ago, I was meditating in my usual fashion, and I began to get this new idea, which was so weird that I immediately shifted into, this is not the truth. This is not a transmission about the nature of reality. This is a plot for a science fiction novel that I should write, and tried to hold that as the defense. That was my shield against the onslaught of this thing. And I've never been one for Atlantis or Lemuria or all these invisible prehistoric lands and places that people enjoy so much. But I was told a very funny thing, which I will share with you. it's a funny idea. Now let's see, how does it go? It has two versions, one of which speaks a scientific language, the other speaks a mythological language. Okay, so the scientific language goes like this. There's something in the universe called a fractal soliton of improbability. This means it's a unicate event. It only happens once in the lifetime of a universe. You can think of it as a wavelength with one wave. That's why it's called a soliton. And if one of these things move not in ordinary three-dimensional space, but in some kind of much higher spatial manifold, and when they collide with a planet, or when one collides with a planet in a universe, the time stream of that planet is divided, and two copies of the entire planet spring into existence without either having any knowledge of it. It just is something which happens. So this voice was telling me that this had happened to the Earth, and that this was the secret that we were all striving to understand, was that an event in the past had actually divided our time stream, and that a twin of this planet had come into being in another dimension. Okay, so that's the scientific explanation of it. So the mythological explanation was that the universe, it's Gnostic, that the universe is the creation of a demiurge, not the highest expression of divinity, but a kind of demon, a fallen creature, and that this demiurge was able to coax itself into being and actually incarnate into history as a human being, and that when this happened, this was then the mythological expression of the fractal soliton of improbability. And when it happened, the time stream split.
The universe is the creation of the demiurge, and the demiurge impelled itself in the form of an individual.
Right. And this is sort of,
Waited a long time.
When you're a demiurge, who can hurry?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the time-splitting event had to do with the career of Christ, who was an extraordinary manifestation of energy in the historical time stream, not to be confused with a Buddha or a Mohammed or a Zoroaster, who were great saints. And it was something else. It was, in some sense, what it claimed to be, but in some sense. Okay? So now, at the moment of, and you can choose either the Immaculate Conception or the Resurrection, depending on which side of the bed you got up on today. But at that moment, the time stream split, and this other place came into being without having any awareness that, and they were identical at that moment, these two worlds. Now, Christ had no children. So, what I forgot to say was that the event, the fractal soliton of improbability, has this quantum mechanical half charge, so that in one of the universes it happens, in the other universe it doesn't happen. And so everything about these two worlds was the same, except that in one of them the Immaculate Conception had not taken place, or the resurrection had not taken place. Now, because Christ had no children, in the world in which he was absent, it was not a genetic line which was missing. It was an ideological line which never received expression. And consequently, as time passed, first decades and then centuries, the absence of this particular intellectual influence in the world changed the world radically in the following way. Greek science did not suffer the suppression that occurred with the conversion of Constantine. The academies were not closed. The Hermetic knowledge was not repressed. Greek science did not suffer the suppression that occurred with the conversion of Constantine. The academies were not closed. The Hermetic knowledge was not repressed. conversely, the empire was stronger and was able to repel the barbarian invasions of the 2nd to the 5th century. And mathematics, which had halted in our world at Diophantus, proceeded through his disciple Hypatia to develop a calculus by AD 370, so that the millennium of Christian stasis that occurred in our world did not occur in that world. And as time passed and engineering advances occurred, by around 850, they had ships which were able to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and they encountered the Mayan civilization reaching its fullest flower in Guatemala and on the Yucatan Peninsula. And in fact, in this vision, I saw the Roman Emperor Cosmodorus V make a pilgrimage to Tikal in 920 to be present at the coronation of a king at the end of Baktun 8. Anyway, this Greco-Roman imperial culture immediately recognized the genius of the Mayans in mathematics and astronomy, and Europe was transformed into an amalgamation, a Greco-Mayan civilization with the... So let me see. And this civilization continued to develop. Now, one of the influences which the Mayans brought into Europe around the year 950 was their extremely sophisticated psychopharmacopoeia and shamanism. And this mated with Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, so that rather than science developing as it developed in our world, a kind of magical psychopharmacolytic technology of thought and understanding was what was developed over the centuries. And then in later centuries before it happened in our world, they contacted the Orient, and the Sung, the dynastic influence of the Sung, poured itself into the creation of a global civilization, such that by around 1200 AD, they were able to land on the moon and create a cybernetic global civilization similar to the kind we have now. They continued evolving with all this psychotronic and shamanically derived, and now by this time you can imagine it was an unbelievably exotic and alien civilization compared to our own. The fruits of their psychedelic and psychoanalytic investigations into higher space was the discovery of our world. They found out what had happened. They figured it out by studying dreams, and by making deep journeys into the psychedelic space. They were able to discover our sleeping unconscious with its repository of the legacy of the Christian centuries under the reign of this demiurgic ideology. And they conceived of the notion of saving us. And it has to do with this whole thing about the UFOs and influence in dreams and astral traveling, and the other side is actually the manifestation of this bizarre Greco-Mayan postmodern starfaring civilization trying to reach across the dimensions to save us from the momentum of our history by making us aware of, first of all, their existence, and also their technology, which is evolving toward a point where I think around the Mayan millennium, around 2012, the time island we will flow past the time island, and the two time streams will be rejoined, and we will make peace with this civilization, which is now 1,000 years more advanced than us, with this totally different cultural history and this completely different take on reality. So this came to me in the space of about 15 seconds. And more details have flowed in, and I use it mostly as a meditational device because it's so interesting to ask to be told about how this other civilization developed, its amazing exoticism, its Neoplatonism, its Taoism, its Mayan influences, melded into a completely different kind of civilization than the one that we inherited. I've always thought, that Christianity, without making any judgment about Christ himself, that Christianity is hands down the single most reactionary force in all of human history. And where would we be had that 1,200 years not been given over to this peculiar meditation, All the pieces were in place for the kind of civilization that I've outlined. It was just a coincidence. Kat does not endorse this idea or even encourage it.
He only told it to me a couple of days ago in Apache Junction in a truck stop or something, and he didn't tell me it as the plot for a science fiction novel. He said, this is the truth. And then I said, let's get back to it being a good science fiction novel.
Well, the thing is that it would, on our level, explain perhaps the questions you were asking earlier of why the teaching plants.
Sure.
Yeah.
Another thing I was curious while you were talking about this is the physics of nowadays. It's like if you have an electron on one side of the universe and split it into two and separate them by the universe, they're still in communication with each other. So is that why, logically, you can bring the time island back together again?
Yeah, this would be a quantum mechanical, super macrophysical Bell's theorem event, a kind of hyperdimensional vacuum fluctuation where the two worlds spring apart, sail along for a period, and then parity is conserved and they're rejoined.
Well, this is interesting. I've had dreams that
Yes.
are parallel what you're
Dreams are
describing
really like
here, and
that.
it's very interesting that you bring this up. I've not heard of it before. And another thing I was curious is, like, this takes place in, this would be on a human experience level, what you're speaking of. Now, with the plant kingdom, would they remain in connection between the species?
We're free to have it any way we like.
So it's how has Christianity possibly affected the evolution of plant species in this time stream, as opposed to the other? Have they gone on varying?
How does our lack of, say, 100,000 or million species in the last 200 years that the other planet has, how does that affect the parity between the two?
You mean, how does our destruction and contort... Well, the part of the myth that I didn't tell you, which I will now tell you, was that naturally, they were developing and exploring technical options many hundreds of years ago, and they discovered the theoretics for nuclear fusion and fission, but they never used it until a few hundred years later. One of their great theoreticians, this was after they had discovered our time stream, made the prediction that the physics of atomic explosions were such that they would cross the time stream. And so they performed an experiment by detonating an atomic device in what is our year 1907. And this was the Tunguska event. And then by monitoring the dreams of Siberian shaman, which they had in clear focus, they saw, this explosion which we set off actually did occur in both time streams. And at that point, they became very interested in monitoring our time stream because they were picking up the dreams of a Swiss telegraph worker who seemed to be pushing toward an unimaginable conclusion. So now there is a certain amount of urgency, because if we explode our atomic stockpiles, it will wreck the place that they call homeworld.
Ata.
Yes. Yes, not self-preservation, because they now have star flight and encompass many systems, but preservation of home world, which on the other side is a vast botanical and ecological preserve from pole to pole. I mean, it's a sacred site of pilgrimage. It's the home of the species. It's the earth. And the notion that suddenly great parts of it will be blown apart by leakage from hyperspace of one of our atomic wars is impelling them now to attempt to open the doorway and rejoin the time streams, and we'll be allowed a few years inside the botanical park to acclimate, and then most people will ship off for the stars, I imagine. The British science fiction writer Ian Watson has a wonderful book called Chekhov's Journey, in which he talks about the Tunguska event, and his theory is that it was a catastrophic failure of a Soviet time travel experiment conducted shortly after the turn of the next century.
Tough one to prove, right?
Obviously. Why didn't we think of that? Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I've thought of that before. You know, it's the claim of Christian theologians that Christ comes in the center of history. They speak this same language. Before Christ, no souls were entering heaven. He freed the valve, and now it's possible to enter into heaven. Before his intercession, that was impossible. You're right, but that's where I left them, was pre-Vatican II. Before I had this idea, I had another idea, which I'll tell you, which is a completely different kind of idea. And it's the idea that there is an overmind. This doesn't involve other dimensions. There is an overmind co-present on this planet, and when the development of technology exceeds the development of ethics, then this overmind can work miracles. And because the overmind is plugged into each of the individual minds that compose it, this miracle always has this unbelievably creepy quality of being exactly the thing which would convince you to change your mind. I mean, in other words, it's like it reads you so perfectly that it's able to present the one situation which you cannot refuse. So in the case of Rome, it was that, Rome was a pigsty. Pasternak called it a bargain basement on 2 floors. It ran on slavery, and it ran on brutality and captive populations and an outrageous garrisoning of military power in foreign lands. And people like Diophantus, this mathematician I mentioned, and hero of Alexandria, these people were on the brink of the calculus and the steam engine. So the overmind, seeing that and seeing their appalling ethical state, sent the miraculous personage of Christ, who, in a world where information could not move faster than a horse's gallop, this religion within 60 years was beating at the gates of Rome itself. It was like a fire, just burned through the empire and changed everything and halted technical advance, and everything stopped. Now, I created this idea in an effort to explain the UFOs, because, the new theory of UFOs, or the new school of UFOs, says we've been wrong to ask what are they. That has not been fruitful. What we should be doing is asking what are they doing. And we can analyze what they're doing in the same way that we can analyze what anybody is doing through sociological polling of human populations. We can find out what the flying saucers are doing. So they polled human populations, and what they discovered is that what the flying saucers are doing is they are sowing disbelief in science. They cause people to not believe in scientists, because scientists come up so lame. when asked to explain flying saucers. It's like the flying saucer is the confounding of science in the same way that the resurrection was the complete confounding of Greek Stoicism and Democritean materialism in the Roman world. And it's conceivable, that the flying saucer, the statistics are now something like 11% of the American population have seen a flying saucer, 52% believe flying saucers are real, whatever that may mean, and so forth. So it is a faith which is percolating up from the lower levels. It's people who live in trailer courts and read Fate magazine who are the staunchest believers in this thing. But what it may be is an intercession on the part of the overmind, which it can do anything. It can do anything from our point of view. And in the most extreme version of this idea, I said, what if enormous spacecraft were to fall into orbit around this planet? And what if television images of this craft were to be beamed into every home on the planet, and then a teaching revealed some completely mind-boggling thing which you could have thought of it yourself, but you never did, which is always how these things are. And then after 30 days of melting the nuclear arsenals and causing all cancer to appear and curing all infectious diseases and delivering this message, the enormous spacecraft disappeared. 30 days. So then everybody says, my God, we have been abandoned. We have been abandoned again into time, and, history would halt. Everybody would do nothing but study the teachings of the saucer and try and figure out how we could get right with them to get them to come back. Dogmatism, theories of communication, priestcraft, the whole thing. So you see, though I'm fascinated by the flying saucer and what it says about the malleability of mind and matter, I think mature civilizations should not be haunted by messiahs or flying saucers, that these things are like metaphysical spankings imposed from on high that are designed, saying, here it's a boot in the tail, wake up, stop repressing.
Well, let's take your two ideas. It's neither one of them is that old. And what does the overmind have to do with or think of the double time stream?
Well, now that's a question I never would have asked. You mean if that's true? I sort of think of these as mutually exclusive.
Well, his two theories, the earlier one was that the overmind was injecting forces of change or conservatism into the world. The other, that events that came from, now that was from the demiurge. Is the demiurge related to the overmind?
No, I think the demiurge is like a negative expression of the overmind.
But created the universe? How did the overmind get in there to be running the Earth, at least?
Well, I think of the overmind as the logos. It's the understanding and self-existence which permeates everything. And the demiurge is the force of matter and time and cosmic destiny that is always trying to lock in the logos and condition it and make it subject to the rules of the physical universe of space and time. And the logos is like something from, this is all Gnostic theology, by the way. This is just straight from the book. The logos is trying to struggle through the labyrinth of the material universe to escape, to rejoin the real source of itself, which is outside of matter. Matter is viewed as an entrapment. If any of you have read the late works of Philip K. Dick, he was probing in these areas. He was a genius. His book, Velas, is pure exegesis of his internal unravelment of what was going on. And he believed, his take on it was, he believed that from AD 69 until 1948, no time had actually passed, and that we were living in apostolic time. and that the crucifixion lay only 75 years in the past, and that the Demiurge had inserted a false history, and the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, he believed, were actually the Logos as printed letters, and that when the Nag Hammadi manuscripts were deciphered, it was like this informational creature would come alive and again be present on the earth, that the Logos, beginning in 1948, was beginning to infuse everything, and that shortly it would dissolve the illusion of the intervening 1860 years, or whatever it was, and then we would realize that the prophecy would be fulfilled and that the last days were upon us. That's right. That's right. He didn't get around to the Antichrist, to his credit, probably. Have to distinguish between Christ, the person, the teacher, and this thing called the Christos, which is this archetype of such power and force that immediately people of ill intent could get lined up behind it and impose their will. Yeah, sell love and sell forgiveness, and what a scam. And the Christos is the thing. History is ruled by the archetypes which people can generate. I mean, most people are very ordinary. I mean, your Mick Jaggers and your Henry Kissingers, they're very ordinary people, but they are able to project an archetype, and that is the thing which sets them apart. And when that reaches the kind of super intense focus that you get in a Mohammed or a Christ, well then, history is just putty in the hands of the force, not the person. The person is usually martyred in some horrible way, but the archetype draws energy to itself, and we don't understand how this process works. If there ever is developed by benevolent or malevolent forces a science of social control, it will be a science of knowing how to project archetypes, and different archetypes apparently are suitable to different times. I mean, you could almost posit an astrological theory of archetypes, but it's something about how, what's appropriate for the 1st century AD is not appropriate for the 15th. But when the archetype is appropriate, nothing can stop it. What the modern term for archetypes is paradigm, and we expect it not to be a person, not a messiah, but an idea which will save us all, and which then gives us certain affinities with mystical Judaism, where the messiah was expected in the form of an idea. And this is sort of our faith. We're messianic ideologues or something like that. Oh, I agree with you. I think ultimately all dualisms have to be dissolved in the notion that, there is one thing. I mean, that's the Platonic faith. The problem is all these secondary and tertiary operational levels where, we're trying to actually operate in a universe of scarcity, in a body which requires energy and all these things. This is really the central problem in Western thinking, I think, is the tension between dualism and unity and matter and spirit, and how do you handle it? I think, that we are spiritualizing matter. This is what technology is, and that the spiritualizing of matter is the highest expression of our technological output, and that this will become more and more what we are about, so that in the next century the difference between mind and brain and cell and machine will all have been subsumed under a new vocabulary, because we're hardwiring our minds, and we are making the artifacts of our culture intelligent, and we are breaking down the barriers between ourselves, between ourselves and larger databases and this kind of thing, so that the old I'm an ego inside a skin definition it gives way to some kind of much more malleable and plastic thing.
Well, as an astrologer, one of the images that I like is the symbol for Pisces, which is two lines with a line going through it, and it's the definition of relationship quality by opposition. It's polarity, it's right, wrong, good, bad, male, female, Russians, Americans. The Aquarian one, which is the two lines of waves over each other, is one of resonance, and it's one of dolphins jumping in the water together. It's one of people coming together and realizing, like, how I resonate with you and what I have to give you and you have to give me, but you'll have something to give me that other people can't, and so on, and we need to swim together. And that breaks down all of the dualistic bonds and I think we're right at that crux right at the moment, and that place between Pisces and Aquarius, where we're kind of two worlds, again, flipping from one side to the other of opposition, being torn from life and death, and seeing as the Christ, I feel, was that prototype, that template of light and spirit with matter coming together and saying, I can dance in this and I can leave it and I can come back into it. I have this power. It's my conscious, compassionate love that is just so unbounded that it gives me the opportunity to play in clay if I choose.
Much of what I say is Alfred North Whitehead, his philosophy, and believe me, if you're looking around for a serious ontological foundation, you don't have to read Sanskrit. Alfred North Whitehead will serve very admirably Science in the Modern World, Process and Reality. He was and remains the great psychedelic philosopher of the 20th century in the era of Bergson. You had another question.
Well, yeah, I'm going to be 84 in the year 2012, and I'm wondering how best to manage my life so that I'll be ready for that time crescent.
Well, I don't know. I think that the canyons of the Creode down which we as individuals are moving, those walls are getting higher and higher too. A lot of times when I had these intense contacts with the teaching entity, I would have an anxiety about what should I do? What is it for me to do? And it always said, nothing. Relax. You know, your function is to just, you'll be present where you're necessary.
Oh.
And I really, this isn't a fatalism, this is a kind of recognition of the dynamics of time that the thing is trying to teach, you see. It's trying to say that if you understand how process works, you will always understand where you are in any given process, and then you won't have anxiety about not occupying some other point in that process, you know. But when I began having these ideas, the only way I could previously relate to the notion of the end of the world was that I had a head full of cartoons of bearded men in sandals carrying signs on street corners saying, repent, repent. And here was I, you know, former Marxist, former this, former that, espousing these unimaginable things. But it's always good to do your homework. And I discovered there's a wonderful book called The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, in which he details the history of millenarianism. That's what this phenomenon is. The belief by a person or a group of people that the end of the world is about to occur. And it existed among the Jews of the post-exilic period. It's part of the phenomenon, or it's part of the social expectation that gave Christ his entree. The early patristic Christians lived in the imminent expectation of the end of the world. And then during the medieval period, the most utopian, prophetistic, millenarian movement before Marxism was Floraism, or the people who followed the teachings of Joaquin of Flora, who was a wandering monk who predicted the end of the world. Let's see, I think for 1244, and he died in 1222. But his followers carried on, and the Pope had to send out armies to quell uprisings as people wanted to distribute the wealth because they felt the end of the world was upon, and why should anybody go to work, and this sort of thing. Similarly, in the year 1000, there was great expectation of Christ's imminent return. So this is a thing which the human mind, at least in its Western expression, seems to seek to do. Islam, too, has its apocalypses. 1967 wasn't bad. I mean, I thought it was happening. I thought we were months away from a new secular order for the ages. But my theory of history views these things not as evidence against such a thing occurring, but as evidence that it will occur, that these uprisings and outbreaks of irrational expectation of the millennium are in fact temporal reflections. They are catching the light on the temporal prism from the object at the end of history, which contains the apocalyptic scenario. It's very important to manage the apocalypse and the millennium. It's very important that people not confuse the cleansing flames of transcendence with the ability to use thermonuclear weapons against your ideological enemies. It's a very delicate matter because our mythologies and our fears run so deeply. But I think that it's an awareness of this potential, of the existence of this law of temporal compression. And of course, institutions don't promote millenarianism because institutions want people to invest their money at low interest and long term, and and have the expectation that everything will carry on pretty much as it has. But an examination of the last 500 or 1,000 years of human history would lead anyone, I think, to the conclusion that everything is going to be swept away, and everything that replaces it is going to be swept away, and that we are just moving into an era of change which might as well be called apocalyptic and must be made millenarian. Otherwise, it will just end in some kind of Götterdämmerung, and the worst boogeymen of Western culture will emerge and destroy us. Yeah.
I know how the wave all comes together and accelerates toward this transition point. I never call it the end, because then the beginning of a new series of many leveled waves is there, right? I mean, this is...
That's right.
I guess I believe in flux, and so the whole process is one wave. At that moment we begin another process. Sometimes you discuss that point as being the end of the universe, which you did a little while ago, and sometimes I feel like when you're as close, when everything is accelerated like it seems to have recently, and you're as close to a moment of transformation of some sort as we seem to be, you see great strides forward being made and great slips backwards being made all at the same time, right? It seems possible that the transformation will be not so fantastically physical as the end of the universe, or the turning inside out of the whatever this is, but actually just a sweep through, worldwide peace of mind. What if that occurred, And that's large enough to qualify, it seems to me, for the changeover in the wave.
Yeah, I think it's the hardest thing to know is the nature of what this ultimate compression is.
The scale.
What it means. I mean, like one way I imagine it, and that's why I love to quote Joyce about man becomes dirigible. I imagine it as the day when your mind becomes your home. And all over the world people just realize that now their mind is their home.
But this,
And
you feel free to describe that as the end of history or the end of the universe?
not the end of the universe, the end of history, because I think history is some kind of involvement with matter. It's a wrestling with the angel of matter, and the end of history is when you pin the angel of matter to the mat, and then you stand up and you say, I am the Adamic human being made of light, and you leave the realm of matter and return to some previously hidden dimension. Whitehead called these things epochs, these long periods of time, and he called transitions from one to the other a shift of epochs. Well, we've only been doing things like measuring the speed of light since 1910 or something like that. All the so-called constants of our physics are based on minuscule periods of actually monitoring these things to see if they are constants. And so I can imagine it as a shift in the laws of the universe that somehow cause consciousness to perceive itself more as it must truly be. And I'm always trying to find physical models for these transcendental hallucinations. And the one which fits this is a few years ago, this Scandinavian astronomer Hans Alfvén wrote a book called Worlds and Anti-Worlds. And in it he talked about what's called a vacuum fluctuation. A vacuum fluctuation is where suddenly, out of nothingness, there emerge a stream of particles, and they are equally particles and antiparticles, and they sail along for a period of time, and then they collide again, and each particle is destroyed by its antiparticle, and so what is called parity is conserved, meaning that when you add up all the charges, positive and negative, you get zero. So it's okay that this matter came from nothing and returned to nothing. This violates no laws as long as parity is conserved. But the interesting thing about this phenomenon, which is called a vacuum fluctuation, is that there seems in quantum mechanics no rule which would limit the size of such a phenomenon as this. So it's conceivable that our entire universe is an enormous vacuum fluctuation, and it's just, 10 high 72 particles have emerged from nothingness and are hurtling through space, and in another dimension, a parallel dimension, the anti-universe, which is the twin of this universe, is also hurtling through space, and at some point in future time, completely unpredictable from the state given within each universe, the two will collide, and and parity will be conserved, and all particles and antiparticles will disappear. However, the interesting thing is that photons, which is what light is composed of, do not have antiparticles. They're this one weird exception. So that when the universe collided with its antimatter twin, what would be left would be a universe made only of photons. And those photons would be in the configuration they were in the moment when the cosmic collapse of the state vector occurred. Well, we have no idea what the physics of a photonic universe would be about. A limiting case, or a good first try, would be that it would just be nothing and no life and no self-reflection and but why posit that? There's such a persistence in the perennial philosophy of the notion that spiritual development is somehow related to light, and to the cultivation of inner light, and to the creation of light bodies, and the stabilizing of light. So, it's possible to suggest that the world of the imagination is simply the world of internal light, that it's a world where light is manipulated by thought in the way that in this world physical organism manipulates matter. And so that, you live in the radiant castles of the imagination after a shift of epochs in which the photonic mode predominated. That's just one way of imagining it. It's one of the richest meditations there is, to try to imagine the millennium. Again, it's this thing, what would you have if you could have anything? I mean, sometimes I imagine it, Hieronymus Bosch's great triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, where men and women of all races mingle among giant wrens and strawberries and feed each other pomegranates under an autumnal sun in an endless rolling park-like world of exotic vegetables and sexual excess and hard stuff to be. And,
sounds better than the end of the universe.
you can really take a readout on yourself by seeing how would you like things to be. I mean, sometimes my fantasy is I would like to be alone on a starship 10,000 light years from home with all the books in the universe, and I would dress like Captain Ahab, and I would stride around the catwalks inside this echoing starship, and faithful robot slaves would bring me crumbling volumes of ancient lore, which I would say, no, this is a little too Vincent Price. How about... I love, if any of you are into science fiction, the science fiction of Cordwainer Smith is really wonderful. And one of his stories, The Starship, is George Washington's estate, Mount Vernon, in New York. And it's all exactly like Mount Vernon in Washington's time, except in the library of the big plantation house, there's one room from which the thing is controlled, and it's actually a starship in mid-flight. More questions about this time theory? Or
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned here how the now is flooded with future perception.
Yes.
And I have it's really part of the Tibetan practices, but it's always something which captures my imagination. It's just, how come it's now? And the fact that these future perceptions are so tremendously tangible to us, especially while sitting in meditation or while eating a meal even or something, and there's this, how come it's not yesterday, and how come it's not tomorrow, and how come that I'm here now when I just have to flick my mind and I'm in yesterday, and equally easy in tomorrow. I wonder if you have anything to say on that one.
Well, I think that life proceeds through time. It's an effort by organism to map something one dimension larger than itself. So it takes a whole life to do it. A life is an effort to map a something, and the now is the moving edge of the mapping process. You cannot map it instantly or you would be it. And so what being in time is experiencing the incremental mapping of this higher order object. And that's why hopefully a long life would give wisdom, because a person would begin to get the whole picture.
Oh.
So the now is kind of like the edge of the pencil as it moves over the
that's what we were
ground.
trying.
Yes, well, what did Plato say? That the present is the moving image of eternity. That's pure good Platonism.
Projection, much as our shadows are two-dimensional.
Well, you can think of it as you can think of the now as a kind of laser which is moving over a larger surface and illuminating it, scanning it. It's scanning something, and it takes it a while to scan it, and then at the end all the data is in place, and then you say, oh yes, I see now what the object of cognition was. And our faith is, and there's no reason to doubt it, that this is a great transcendent experience. This is the resolution, the peace that passeth understanding as you sink into death. It's just that we like to think that the psychedelic experience gives us a preview. No one escapes the final realization. It's just that some people do postpone it to their last act. But there's no reason for that, because it is the mystery, the culmination, it is the date palm and the wellspring.
I'd like to, I'm always interested in pursuing things from the Mayan angle, so I'd like to ask about how this theory of time relates to the individual. It's somewhat related to BJ's question. There's some sense I have that in their techniques, and certainly you've experienced and other people have experienced this with the mushroom at high doses, of traveling through time and actually seeing the future or seeing the past. And I was wondering if you could say more about that and some framework for understanding how that is possible.
Yes, well, I think psilocybin seems to be the great teacher of history, and part of its teaching is history. It views a person without a history as a person with amnesia, a person with a diminished capacity, because your history gives you the power of your convictions. The way I use the wave, or the way I've been using it recently, is to try and study the time immediately ahead of us so that we don't misjudge what's going on. And it's a mathematical process. There's no indeterminacy about it if we anchor the whole wave system on 2012. And what I see from that anchorage point is in the 67-year cycle from 1945 to 2012, we have reached that point which resonates with the larger 4,306-year cycle at that point, which corresponds to the collapse of the Roman Empire around 475 AD. In other words, we have been through a period of imperialist expansionism, which has lasted for a number of years, certainly since the beginning of the 80s. But I see a retrenchment of that and a recidivist tendency, a tendency toward religious fundamentalism, rigid social structures, and in short, the sorts of things which could be seen as valid resonance patterns to the early medieval phase of European civilization. The period from AD 474, let's for shorthand call it 500 AD, the period from 500 AD to 1500 AD, in other words, to the discovery of the New World by Columbus, that 1,000-year period is the resonance that we are going to experience from now till the late 90s. Around 1998, we will reach the beginning of the Renaissance and the discovery of the New World. But we are going to have to endure a period not entirely to our liking. We represent the pagan Hellenistic spirit which has held full sway within the empire for the past 25 years. And we may feel constricted now, but I think that our ideas and our position in society has further constriction to undergo before it reflowers downstream a bit. So when I first realized that, I felt very pessimistic. But then I asked myself, well, what aspects of medieval life could I groove? What aspects of that medieval eschatology were salutary to my needs and wishes? And I discovered that, it was an age of great mystical faith and illumination. It was an age of communities of like-minded people seeking transformation far from the turbulence of the collapse of the empire. So I am not of that my theory leads me away from those people in the New Age who think we're about to be catapulted into the corridors of power. I think that's preposterous, and the evidence for it is zero. And I think better we should tend our gardens and form brotherhoods and sisterhoods of affinity, and realize that the task of transformation is one of a lifetime, our lifetimes, you know. And every time someone like Dick Price or Tony Lilly moves from the wheel, I always wonder, you know, how did it feel to know it wasn't finished, you know, to go with it undone. And oh yes, I have no doubt that when the saucer comes, that Tony or Dick will be in control. One of them. What is it Bob Dylan says in his song, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot fighting in the captain's tower? But yes, so I don't know if that answered your question, Robin, but I wanted to get it in, because the real meat for most people for this idea about time is not the mathematics of it, that and the symmetry of it. That's only pleasing to a certain mentality. But really, what does it tell us about the years immediately ahead? And what it says is, you know, consolidation, illumination, community, and self-discipline.
I can only say thanks 1,000 times that we don't have to go through it for 1,000 years and only for like 15 years. This acceleration seems to me to be very, very convenient. Imagine if we were born in 500 AD and we had to look forward to that.
Yes, well, that's why I say, you know, imagine the people who lived in times when the temporal river was stagnant, or even when countercurrents swept it backwards. This is the anguish of the ancestors. This is the sacred trust that must not be betrayed. The pogroms and the invasions and the atrocities conducted across history can only be somehow redeemed if we, who are the living wavefront of this genetic experience, do not fumble the ball, you know. All our ancestors are watching to see how we will do.
Oh.
Kath.
I would like to address Robin's question as well, because it seemed like you were asking sort of on a more mechanical, how did this happen?
Well, yeah, how can it
level.
be that that the Mayans or we on psychedelics can travel through time and see these things?
My image for it that explains that phenomenon to me, and I've had the same experience, past and future, is, well, Terence is just referring to the temporal river, is that it's a river which flows two ways, from the past to the future, and from the future to the past. And if you put yourself out in the middle of it, let go of control, let go of fear, and maybe you want to choose your orientation, or maybe you don't. You can just find out where you flow, or you can sort of face the past or face the future and flow there. I mean, this is not a physicist's explanation of how this happens, but it seems to work that way, you know, and that we think perhaps far too much of the past creating the future, and that we should think more, and perhaps other people have, of how it's flowing the other way. And this is how some so-called primitive people have managed to conserve the very simple, effective beauty of their lifestyle, is, and that real strong feeling that every moment is now, because they're thinking of it simultaneously.
I think of that, and that also sets my mind off, that's kind of like the river's flowing both ways, and if you kind of take a step to the side somehow, that you'll catch the current from the future. That's appealing, but also, I mean, I always play with these metaphors, and maybe I'm literalizing them too much. Is it possible to step out of that stream in some way, and then looking above and sort of choose where you're going to descend into it? Or another image that came to mind is, are there somehow holes in the fabric of time that you can shoot through sort of like in 2001, the Stargate opening up, and there's this hole in between, and where you emerge is not the other side of it, but someplace completely different.
If you take the wave seriously and apply it on these short scales of time, you can find your way into, yes, unique configurations of the moment. It's like astrology in that way, and often the content of a psychedelic experience can be later seen to be because of the situation of historical resonance that you weren't perhaps even aware of at the time.
Or if there are parallel worlds, one or many, which ones happen to be adjacent at that moment in the cosmic weather, kind of, It's sort of sometimes I've taken the mushroom just to say, it's like a weather person, to say, okay, I just want to see what's happening out there right now, not with a will in it, And then, you can find that it's about knitting in your rocking chair, or you can find that you're just on some landscape that you couldn't have conceived of before.
The essence of Tao is the correct apperception of process. That's what Taoism is to understand process is to be a Taoist. And I think that this is almost a formal rendering of the notion of Tao, almost an effort to create a mathematics, an algebra of the Tao. And as long as it's true to the notions which Taoism conserves, which is of flow and determinacy within indeterminacy, it serves. This is what understanding time is to understand process, but to understand it so well that it's like a sense for you. It's like seeing. This is the kind of seeing that is very important, to see into time. It's what history and culture have experimented with, but it's what we now, by identifying that as what is going on, can accelerate much faster. Anything else?
I was, just picking up on the conversation with Michael this morning. Maybe you could talk more about the other.
Oh, the other. Well, I'm not sure exactly what he meant by talking about the other. I mean, the other is just a way of thinking about all of these things that we name spirit, God, demon, void. It's that there just necessarily is a place off our map. Whenever you have a map, it implies the part that is not on the map. And the other, the truly other, is it lies outside the domain of language. It's like the unspeakable. All you can do is point at it, And the Gnostic idea of God was that it was totally other, that there was nothing in this universe that gave any clue whatsoever as to the nature of God, that was its essence, was to be completely other. But, the other trickles through and reverberates in our lives in all kinds of dimensions. I mean, the first other that you meet is the world. And at a later point in your development, your attachment to another human being can become a confrontation with the other. So it's just a way of shorthand signifying, right? the dimension that carries you beyond yourself into the things that you previously couldn't expect or imagine. Yeah, that's one notion of it. Or Wittgenstein's unspeakable, or I'm fond of quoting this poem by Trumbull Stickney, where he says, "I lean over your meaning's edge and feel the dizziness of the things you have not said." That's the other. It's the dizziness of the things unsaid, the things that lie beyond the edge of meaning.
Part of the question has to do with, specifically in the mushroom experience at high doses, this sense of alien intelligence or other because I think it's like you said, in some of our systems of conceptions of God, many psychedelic experiences, at least with LSD and other or light dosages, is that I am connected to that, or I'm part of that thing. And but somehow on the tryptamines that it's this alien intelligence. I mean, what do you make of that? Do you feel that?
Well, I don't know quite what to make of that. LSD is self-reflective and integrative, I think. These tryptamines seem to be informational and largely unconcerned with the impact that the information they carry has on the perceiver. I don't know. I think it just must have to do with the fact that the universe is not all smoothed out and filled in, and that this is really an area of personal exploration where you can penetrate into an area, a terra incognito, a place where nobody knows exactly what is going on. We're not used to that experience. We expect to have maps of everything we look at and everywhere we go. But in this, and it is strange that in this one area we don't, that apparently our taboo against looking at the unconscious or delving into the mind has made us content to just fence off this area. Well, then if you climb over the fence and start wandering around out there, you don't know what you're going to find, because the culture has carefully engineered itself to go around all of this stuff. Even I think shamanism is largely concerned with gaining power to protect yourself from the onslaught of the other. You know, they're very concerned to hold stuff back. They don't really have this let's hurl ourselves into it attitude that we have. We found in the Amazon, we were looking for this one plant which had DMT in it, and the ayahuasquero that we were working with, I kept leading the questioning back to the matter of this one plant. And finally he said that it was comida del perro, food for dogs, and which seemed like maybe a put down of some sort. And so then he went back over it again, and he said, well, it's mal and bizarro, it's too strange. So this was a man whose whole life was about taking ayahuasca and triggering hallucination, but he felt, that to go into that plant, it was too weird. And you often have the feeling with those people that they involve themselves in the psychedelic effect like a dancer, almost as little as possible to get the job done. They don't.
I don't think that of Don Fidel. I think that.
Well, in that one case, he
yes,
certainly was.
He did the line at. He did also seem to hold the mushroom in the sort of middle category, but he would use it on his own. He would only administer to others ayahuasca or certain things that he felt very familiar with. But then that was Saturday nights. Wednesday nights he would do things on his own, his work.
Right.
And he would try out some of these other plants or combinations. But I think he was pretty intrepid, actually. He did have boundaries.
In '83, or whenever it was that I was down there last, we were dealing with a different group of shamans on the upper Ampiaku, and it was to get this orally active DMT thing that was made from tree resin. And we had pure chemical DMT as a trade item, or we weren't sure why, but just in case we needed it.
You never go anywhere without it.
Exactly. And so talking to the shaman who could make the Varrola paste stuff, we said this, and he said, oh, you have the essentia, you have the essence. He said, yes. And he said, so what is that like? You say, well, you don't take it orally, you don't take it by mouth, you smoke it. He said, oh, and what happens? And so he described a typical DMT trip to him, and then said, would you like to try it? He said, No, thank you. So, they're not thrill crazy by any means.
Well, I'm reminded of in the latest Castaneda books, he goes into what he calls the old seers and the new seers. And the old seers were, maybe you're more aligned with them, I don't know, but they would be willing to explore any territory. And they made a division between the known and the unknown.
The unknowable.
No, it was the new seers who came up with the third category of the unknowable. In other words, there's this reality, which is the known, and then there's the other realities you go to, which are the unknown. It's like they're not it's like maybe the ayahuasquero takes you to the unknown. But this other realm where they don't go, they would probably call the unknowable, because the impact that it has on you to go in there could be dangerous, or
from the place of the unknown, they could glimpse very briefly the unknowable, and it was usually a pretty shattering experience.
But great emphasis on being able to distinguish the difference between the unknown and the unknowable.
Yeah.
So that whenever one made an error in judgment, it wasn't that dangerous to be up against the unknowable, but you had to recognize it as unknowable, because whenever one didn't, it invariably led to disaster. Of course, that's Castaneda's,
and that's his text.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it makes me think of, I mentioned Wittgenstein's unspeakable. There is, I think, the unspeakable and the unspoken. And all these esoteric and initiatory religious numbers are trading in the unspoken. You come to them and they will whisper in your ear the previously unspoken teaching. They will give you an oral empowerment. But beyond that lies the unspeakable, which no teacher can orally impart or impart any other way, because it lies outside the bounds of transmissibility by its nature. And
Unspeakable is unknowable?
I would, to some degree, I would think so. And that's the thing which then you validate. You can only validate it for itself, in itself, for itself. It is the private object of being. It is not something which I can tell you about or you can tell me about. It's the private mystery that is ontologically private because it's unspeakable.
But I don't think that what is the unspeakable is the same as the unknowable. I think that all of us who have pursued these dimensions have many experiences that it's very hard to talk about, or when you talk about them, it sounds so silly compared to what you experienced, right? It's one of the challenges of having this kind of group discussion or these kinds of workshops is to try to talk about that. But there is, I think, a big area that just doesn't language, don't you think? The ineffable is how I think of it, another word for it. But
well, you can sort of chip away at it. I mean, the whole progress of human development is maybe slowly eroding the unspeakable and turning it into the spoken.
I'd like to speak about that. That's what's been going on in my mind. And I'm glad you did that. Because in a way that is the process of everything from the very beginning to the very end. And we as human beings on the planet are just somewhere in the middle of this whole process of the unknowable becoming the known.
mm-hmm.
And it ties back a little bit to your whole thing of time yesterday, where you said like the physicists are interested in the first, second, or parts thereof, and whereas you're interested in this final or coming up moments or years as things speed up. But what we're looking at is the physicists are looking at basically the physics of it, the form, whatever, the matter, the physics, and what you're looking at are the ideas which are coming into being more and more. This end of time is more and more recognition, so it's really like spirit or mind or knowing, which is accelerating. So it's like the opposite ends. One is the matter coming into form at the beginning, and then at the end is the knowing of all of this, which is coming to a point. And like an ant or whatever lower level of consciousness
is, on different levels, or say a cell, an amoeba, they have their thing, and then there's the unknowable, which is what we are acting in. How can, even inside of our body, the blood cells, can they know of our world of communications and symbols and knowledge? Such as we are on this unknowable is really just a greater universe, a higher level, which is known by a higher way of being, and it's like from each end, whatever the matter here, and then the mind coming into it, and like this point coming up shortly, this 2012, is significant in that it's possibly some sort of, like I say, this opposite end of knowing becoming complete, like life becoming completely aware of all life in of itself. But that's like, is at the end of everything. It seems like that's just a point, like a mid-swing of a pendulum. Started here.
Yes, well then some other process having to do with the career of spirit instead of matter is initiated,
And whether it's the end of everything is rather a human way of approaching it. I mean,
it's a complete end of one way of being.
Of us as a species, as a life development.
It's not just humans. It's all of life.
Of the Earth life entity then.
Right.
But if that life entity goes through a great metamorphosis, it's rather meaningless to say what happens to the rest of the universe, since the rest of the universe right now is a concept in our mind.
Right. Well, that's the metaphysicality of it.
But to say what's never been said, to do what's never been done, to paint what's never been painted, to dance what's never been danced, this is, somehow you're acting for everybody when you do that. It's an amazing thing to do something that's never been done. It means once you've done it, it's been done.
It's pushing the limits out.
That's right.
Putting the fence, it's like a fence going out bigger and bigger, and like all these great minds that go out there and fence off a big area for all of humanity to run around in this area of being and knowing, and it's this whole process of
It's what aeronautical engineers call stretching the envelope. When you fly a fighter plane, you have the predicted engineering performance characteristics, but once you validate that it can do that, then it's up to the pilot to find out, to stretch the envelope, to find out what it can really do, how fast it can turn, how fast it can climb. And that's what we as creative artists do for the human enterprise. And the lacking ingredient is courage, I think. I mean, often I have the feeling that it's no longer, at least in my own life, about seeking the answer. It's about facing it. It isn't about, is it yoga, is it Taoism, is it this, is it that? Now, I think that now I know, at least for me, what it is, but the answer is so appalling and requires such courage to execute it and carry it through that I don't know what to do. I have no doubt that we could all become the Taoist hermit on Cold Mountain, and be that person of whom people in the valley say, "Oh, him, we see him sometimes when it snows very deeply because he comes further down for wood. He comes and goes in the mist and never talks to anybody." We could all become that person. There are no barriers to ultimate spiritual attainment, but what about, your mortgage and your lover and your devotion to French chocolate and all of these things? That's tricky. That's very, very tricky.
Learn how to bake.
Plants, because it really all washes out. Maybe just for an hour of peaking, but it really puts all of that in perspective.
But for instance, like the matter of the flying saucer, I have no doubt that if you took 10 people selected from this group and trekked days east of Death Valley and stayed up all night, and then everybody took 8 dried grams of mushrooms and hooped and hollered and waited that something would happen that would be so appalling and so destructive to our preconceptions of what's possible in this universe that you just come out of it, pointing into the desert and saying, But I'm careful. I don't doubt that appalling things can happen, and that reality can be completely pulled to pieces. And I don't know what that means, but I want to really try and deal with that on my terms, and that's a kind of fear. It's a kind of holding back. That's why, I know people who seem to me superhumanly reckless. I mean, they tell me the things they do, and I just shake my head, because of the power, of the vistas, of the energies that they must have laid their hands on. It's too much for me. I'm a simple scholar and bookish collector type. I'm like Brother John here. We like our home and hearth. But that's the challenge, you see. That's the weird thing about the psychedelics. It is a path, but in a sense it's the end of the path. And then what do you do? Now it's up to you. It's no more about, the guru says in 5 years you'll make progress, or if you just keep eating the spirulina or fiddling with your crystals or something. It's that, no, you've arrived. Now, what do you do with it? Are you really want to be a wandering figure at the edge of civilization, glimpsed occasionally in your tattered cloak with your wild ravings?
Well, that's not the only option. We were talking, Mitch and I were talking this morning about...
Thank you, Tim.
It's tough to do that with kids, see, I know. We were talking about envisioning something and how these plants help you to generate a vision of something real that you want to create or organize in the world, and then they help you to have the discipline and the dedication to carry them out in the real day-to-day, telephone calls and how do I get the money for it kind of way. And that, I think, is a real strength that all of us have, and that it's one of the responsibilities of being granted the visions, is to make the visions then as real as you can. I mean, we do have our bodies here on earth for some time to come. We do have pleasure, of course, which we should all indulge in, but we also have responsibility to make it as much like, even if it's a small step, as much like that fantastic thing we can see in our visions. And I think that, it gives you the object, and then it helps you move toward it. And then we need to do that work and keep refreshing our vision if it gets weak or we start to give up on it, or if we need to shift direction slightly.
I go back to astrology in Saturn drawing a ring around the vision, and then Saturn's stairway, envisioning the steps that it takes to get there, and that you can't jump 40 steps up without losing part of the foundation. And that as an artist myself, I'm finally getting to a place of patience and realizing that the slower it goes, the better it gets. And the statement that I like is, if I only had more time, I'd use less words to write. It's like choosing things carefully and allowing the process. And it's for years I was just like, I've got to get this out, I've got to, but not anymore. It's now I'm really seeing that slow, patient steps create a foundation strong enough to someday, even if it's not in this lifetime, to manifest that dream.
If you use the quality of your daily life as your currency for how you're proceeding towards something, then you know if the quality of your daily life is good, deep, satisfying, and you have a goal, you're probably on the right path, right? If you're saying, God, it's just going to be hell for 3 years till I can get this project together, you maybe should think about it again, you know.
I see that process reflected on a greater scale in just the evolution of life itself, and that if life were to very quickly achieve the knowing pure spirituality, then what good is it? And that's like through humans and through all of our history and time. And so even this coming moment, 2012, that might just be like this reflection of another, even more ultimate. It most likely is. And it's just that reflection, and it's really this endlessly drawn out patient process which is taking its time as long as possible so that every aspect will work into place or whatever. So it's just
And every aspect can be appreciated.
Well, this quality of daily life thing is an interesting point, because I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago we meditated or thought about what would you do if you could do anything, and how...
Go for it.
Oh, there it is.
Stretching the envelope.
Yes. And how you imagine, or if a genie were to suddenly tell you you had not 3 wishes but thousands, and you would begin to dabble in fulfillment, and then of course in all the trivial and superficial things I mentioned, palaces and Ferraris and all this, but then things like that you could move anywhere instantly. How would you choose to travel if you could move anywhere instantly? And things like that. Well, at La Chirera, these possibilities were so real to us that we actually grappled with it sufficiently to see how it would develop. And how it develops is you discover that if you can do anything, the only values which have any meaning, if you can do anything and have anything, are aesthetic values. So that if you could travel anywhere instantly, how would you travel? You would walk, obviously. You know, because it's so tasteful. Because it's so completing. It's such a complete reverence for space and time and your own body and the correctness of the situation. And time and time at La Chirera, someone would be doing something some way, and someone else would say, well, if you're omniscient, why don't you just make it be done? And the answer is because it's crass to do that. You know, the way to do things, if you can do anything, is to do them right.
That's Zen, eh? Like Zen cooking is like that.
I guess. But that realization of the total richness and correctness of the moment that's the correct interpretation of the attainment of these cities. Things would go on at La Chirera as an example of how the Tao works, where I would walk out into the jungle and there would be butterflies circling, and I would hold out my hand and speak to the butterflies with my mind and invite them to come down and land on my hand and display themselves. And the butterflies would do this. They would come and land in my open hand and turn and strut and show me all facets of themselves. And this would go on for like 2 or 3 minutes, where I would experience gratitude, reverence, delight, and then this other emotion, the need to show somebody else what I could do. And so then I would walk back to the camp, and smiling with a bizarre inward smile, I would select one of my campmates and ask them to walk out into the jungle with me. And then, to their horror, I would stand underneath this tree and gesture and ask for the butterflies to come down and land in my hand, and people would just turn away in a mixture of horror and embarrassment that anyone could be such a jackass, first of all, and that anyone could be so mentally deranged as to operate like that. And of course the butterflies would have nothing to do with me, and I would just be left just sputtering, you know, and it happened many times.
Many times? Oh, no.
Oh, many times.
Gracious.
Because there was
I mean,
this...
that you took people? And were left sputtering, or
it was not only the butterflies. It was that as long as I had no ego, I could work magic. But it was not. It was magic that was the necessary magic. It absolutely had no use other than to make my life a more perfect work of art. As an example, we had a pot in which we cooked avena, oatmeal, every morning. It was our magic pot. And the scrubbing out of this pot was a major pain in the neck and was consequently a rotating camp duty. So in the height of this, it became my turn to scrub this pot. And I went down to the little spring where the sand was and squatted down by the water, and I picked up the sand and I rubbed it onto the pot to get ready to scrub it. And then I looked, and the black stuff was just flaking off. It was like easy off or something. And it was just, and I just took the pot, holding it by its two little protrusions, and immersed it in the spring like this, and looked, and all the black stuff was just flaking off and crudding off and going, and I was just amazed, the magical scouring agent. So then I went back to the camp and got my most severe critic, and again, smiling with inward benignness, I led them down to the river and said, I'm going to teach you how to wash a pot, the Zen master, you see. So we squat across from each other by the spring, and I pick up the sand and I put it on, and she says, so I'm supposed to know that sand can wash a pot? I say, no, look. And again it failed me, and I just was, by then I was getting the message, and I stopped. And there was one other instance which was very puzzling, because I actually saw another person go into it too. And it had to do with this prophecy which my brother had made. One of the motifs which circled in his mind space during this period was what he called the good shit. And this was, he imagined that at some time in the past he had gotten a sample of Afghani hash that had cow manure very, very carefully worked into it, and then the hash had been infected with psilocybin mycelium, and all of the cow manure had been converted into psilocybin, so that he had the psilocybinated hash. And he had this notion that he would invent a musical instrument, like an electric guitar, which when you played it, it would cause this stuff to condense out of the air and rain down on great crowds of people. So anyway, there was this thing about the good shit. And one night he announced that the good shit would appear at a certain time. And so then I went back to my hammock in this hut in the jungle, and the woman who was with me came as well, and we had no watches, but he had said that at 11 p.m. the good shit would appear. So I was settling down to roll my evening joint, and it was this Colombian weed that we had brought in with us. And as I lit the joint, this little thing fell out of the end of it on the floor, burning. And I picked it up, and I smelled it, and it was unbelievable hashish. I mean, hashish to die for. And I was just, and I put it in the pipe, and I smoked it. And I said to this woman, I said, smoke this, and she agreed that it was astonishing.
Your major critic?
No, not my major critic. My major critic was back at the river. So then I looked, and I opened this baggie with this stuff, and I started smoking it, and it didn't change its physical appearance. It still looked like this Santa Marta gold, but the odor and everything was just the finest hash I've ever smoked.